The baby in my arms was turning blue. 1 second she was breathing, the next, just still. A tiny perfect doll whose machinery had suddenly stopped working. The wind howled outside our little cabin on the Nebraska prairie, a lonely, terrible sound, like the whole world was crying. And inside, a different kind of storm was raging, right here in my chest. "Faith, breathe," I begged, my voice a ragged whisper. I patted her back, gentle at first, then harder. Nothing. Her little lips were turning a dark, awful purple. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild animal trapped in a cage. "Sarah," I choked out, a reflex, a desperate call to the one person who always knew what to do. "Sarah, I need you." But Sarah wasn't there. Sarah was out in the cold, hard ground, under a simple wooden cross we'd planted just 6 weeks ago. In the cradle across the room, Faith's twin sister, Grace, started to wail, a sharp, piercing sound that cut right through me. She knew. Somehow she knew her sister was slipping away, and I was failing them, just like I failed their mother. "God, please," I whispered. The prayer of a man who'd stopped believing God listened. Not after the war, not after burying my wife. That's when the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the door, so loud they seemed to cut right through the wind, and Grace's crying. It was impossible. No one should be out here, not in this weather, not in the middle of nowhere. "Help!" I screamed, unable to move, my hand still uselessly patting Faith's back. "Somebody help me!" The latch clicked, the door creaked open, and a figure stood there in the doorway, a silhouette against the dying light. A gust of wind tore through the cabin, extinguishing the lantern on the table and plunging us into near darkness. But I could still see her, a woman, a total stranger, and in that moment I didn't know if I was looking at an angel or something else entirely. She took a step inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and her gaze fell on the tiny blue-tinged baby in my arms. Her expression didn't show pity or fear. It was calm, assessing, like a general surveying a battlefield. "She's not breathing," I managed to say, the words catching in my throat. The stranger didn't say a word. She moved with a speed and purpose that was unnerving. She dropped a small bag by the door and crossed the room in 3 long strides. She reached for Faith. For a split second, I hesitated. Hand my daughter to this stranger who appeared out of a storm like a ghost? But then I looked at Faith's face, and I knew I had no choice. I surrendered my daughter into her hands. The woman was all business. She flipped Faith onto her stomach, supporting her head with one hand, and delivered 3 firm, sharp smacks between her shoulder blades. It was a practiced, confident movement. Then she turned the baby over, placed 2 fingers on her tiny chest, and pressed down. Once, twice. "Come on, little one," she murmured, her voice low and steady. "Breathe for your papa." And then, a miracle. A tiny wet cough, a sputtering gasp. Faith's little body jerked, and she let out a cry. A weak, reedy cry that was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Color rushed back into her face. My knees almost gave out from sheer relief. "Thank God," I whispered, reaching for her. The woman handed Faith back to me, and I clutched her to my chest, burying my face in her blanket, just breathing in the scent of her, feeling the tiny flutter of her heart against my own. When I looked up, the stranger was watching me, her expression unreadable in the gloom. "Fluid in her lungs," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "It happens with the little ones, especially when they come early." My head snapped up. How could she possibly know that? "How did you know they were early?" A shadow seemed to cross her face, a flicker of something I couldn't name. "Their size," she said simply, "and twins often come before their time." I studied her more closely now. She was young, maybe mid-20s, plain, but with strong cheekbones and dark, deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a quiet strength. Her hands, though, were what I noticed. They were slender, but her knuckles were red and calloused. Yet they had moved with the precision of a surgeon. "Who are you?" I asked, the reality of the situation finally hitting me. A stranger had just walked into my home and saved my child's life. "Ruth Holloway," she replied, her gaze steady. "I've come about the position." "Position?" I was confused. My mind was still reeling. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded, slightly damp piece of paper. "Pastor Wilson," she said. "He told me you were in need of help. For your daughters." Of course, the pastor. I had broken down last Sunday, finally admitting I couldn't handle two newborns and a farm all by myself. He had promised to find someone, but I hadn't expected it to be so soon, or for them to arrive in the middle of a life-or-death crisis. "How did you know to come tonight?" I asked, a sliver of suspicion creeping back in. The timing was just too perfect. It was uncanny. "I didn't," she said, her expression never changing. "I arrived in town this morning. The pastor gave me directions. I was delayed by the storm." She paused, then added, "It seems Providence guided my timing." Grace was still crying from her cradle. Ruth glanced over. "May I?" Without waiting for an answer, she moved to the cradle and lifted Grace with its same practiced ease. The baby's cries instantly softened as Ruth rocked her, murmuring soft, soothing sounds. I watched her, a storm of emotions churning inside me. Relief, gratitude, and a sharp, stabbing grief that Sarah wasn't here to do this. As my heart rate returned to normal, the practical, suspicious part of me took over again. I couldn't afford to be careless. Not with my girls. "Miss Holloway," I began, my voice regaining its usual gruffness. "I appreciate what you did tonight, more than you know, but I need to be clear." She looked up, her attention fully on me. "I need a nursemaid for my daughters. That is all. I'm not looking for a new wife." If she was offended, she didn't show it. "I understand, Mr. Morgan. I am here to care for the children, nothing more. The pay is $2 a week plus room and board. That's fair." "How old are they?" she asked, her gaze softening as she looked at Grace. 6 weeks yesterday," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. "Their mother, she died the day they were born." "I'm sorry for your loss," Ruth said, and for the first time her eyes showed a flicker of genuine sympathy. An awkward silence fell between us, filled only by the wind and the crackle of the fire. "There's a small room off the kitchen," I said finally. "It's not much." I glanced at the small bag she'd brought. "Is that all you have?" "I travel light, Mr. Morgan." Something in the way she said it made me wonder what kind of life she was leaving behind. But I didn't ask. As I laid Faith back in her cradle, I saw Ruth adjust her grip on Grace. Her sleeve slid back for just an instant, revealing a thin, pale scar that snaked across her wrist. It was a clean, straight line, not the kind you get from an accident. When she saw me looking, she quickly pulled her sleeve down, her face a blank mask. Another mystery, but I was too exhausted, too grateful to care. Tonight my daughter was alive. The questions could wait for the morning. Dawn broke, painting the prairie in shades of pink and gold. I'd been up for hours, the familiar chores of the farm, a steady rhythm against the chaos in my mind. Tending the livestock, mending the fence the storm had damaged. It was work that didn't require thinking. Which was good, because my thoughts were all tangled up with the mysterious woman sleeping in my cabin. As I walked back to the house, the smell of coffee and frying bacon hit me. For a heartbreaking second, I let myself imagine it was Sarah inside, waiting for me. A ghost of a life that was gone forever. I pushed the door open. The main room was warm, the fire in the hearth blazing cheerfully. And there was Ruth, her back to me, gently bouncing a cooing Grace on her hip while she stirred something at the stove. Faith was awake in her cradle, watching the play of light on the ceiling. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," Ruth said, without even turning around. It was like she had eyes in the back of her head. "Breakfast is ready." The scene was so domestic, so normal, it felt wrong. "You didn't have to cook," I grumbled, hanging my hat on its peg. "Your job is the girls." "It's no trouble," she said, finally turning. "I'm an early riser." She poured me a cup of coffee. It was strong and rich, a world away from the bitter swill I usually made. "This is good, Uri," I admitted, surprised. A small smile touched her lips. "A pinch of salt in the grounds. My mother taught me." She moved around the kitchen with an efficiency that was mesmerizing, serving up oatmeal and cornbread, never once looking flustered, even with a baby balanced on her hip. "Have you done this before? Worked as a nursemaid?" I asked. Not officially, she said, setting Grace back in her cradle. But I helped deliver many babies in my old town, and I cared for my sister's children. Her expression became serious. I should tell you, Mr. Morgan, I have no formal training. What I know I learned from my mother and from experience. After last night, I said, experience seems to count for a hell of a lot. I took a bite of the cornbread. It was warm and perfect. But I have to ask, why would Pastor Wilson send you, a complete stranger to town, out to my farm? Her hands stilled for a fraction of a second. I brought a letter of reference, she said smoothly, and the pastor and I spoke at length. There was something she wasn't saying. I could feel it. But before I could press her, Faith started to fuss. Ruth was at her side in an instant, lifting her with those gentle, capable hands. She's hungry, Ruth said, expertly checking the baby's diaper. Do you have a feeding schedule? My own face clouded over. Sarah, she didn't get to nurse them. I've been using goat's milk with a bit of cloth. I know a mixture that might be easier on their stomachs, she offered. Goat's milk can be rich for newborns. You seem to know a lot about babies, I observed. Again, that shadow crossed her face. As I said, my sister's children. The way she said it, the careful, flat tone. It was the same way I talked when people asked about the war. A wall, built to keep the painful memories inside. I pushed my chair back. I've got to mend the fence in the north pasture. I looked at the twins, then at her. Will you be all right? We'll be fine, Mr. Morgan, she assured me, her voice warm as she looked down at Faith. Dinner will be ready when you return. I paused at the door. Miss Holloway, I'm grateful you came when you did. A real smile touched her lips this time. So am I, Mr. Morgan. The days fell into a strange rhythm. We were two strangers sharing a small space, orbiting around two tiny suns. We barely spoke, but the cabin started to feel less like a tomb. The silence was filled not with grief, but with the soft sounds of babies and the quiet hum of Ruth's lullabies. On the fourth night, another storm rolled in. I was mending a bridle by lamplight when I heard it, a soft, melodic humming from the twins' room. I walked quietly to the door. Ruth was in the rocking chair, her eyes closed, humming a tune that hit me like a punch to the gut. Amazing Grace. Sarah's favorite hymn. My breath caught in my throat. She must have heard me. Her eyes snapped open, and she stopped humming. I'm sorry, she whispered. Did I disturb you? I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. No, I managed. It's just... Sarah used to sing that. Understanding softened her expression. It's a beautiful hymn. My mother sang it to me when I was afraid of storms. I should get back to work, I said, turning to leave. Mr. Morgan, she called softly. I stopped. Faith's breathing seems much better. I've been giving her a tea of wild cherry bark and honey with her milk. It's an old remedy. I turned back, studying her in the dim light. You did that without my permission. No, I didn't, she said, her gaze steady. And I apologize, but I was concerned about the rattling in her chest. I should have been angry. I should have reprimanded her for giving my daughter some strange concoction without asking. But all I felt was a wave of gratitude. Thank you, I said quietly, for caring enough to help her. In that moment, something shifted between us. It wasn't friendship. It was the beginning of trust. As I went back to my work, the memory of her humming, so much like Sarah's, followed me. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth Holloway was more than just a nursemaid who'd answered an ad. She was a puzzle, and I was starting to think that her arrival on my doorstep was no coincidence at all. That night, I had the dream again, the one where I'm standing helpless as Sarah slips away. Her eyes are locked on mine. Promise me, Abe, she whispers, her voice weak. Promise me you'll love them enough for both of us. But this time, there was something new. A fragment I'd forgotten, or maybe my mind had just invented it. Help will come, she'd whispered. I've arranged it. I woke up in a cold sweat. Had she really said that? Was it possible? I went to the kitchen to make coffee, but a lamp was already lit. Ruth was in the rocking chair, holding a fussing Faith. Couldn't sleep, she said softly. Bad dreams? She asked, her perception unnerving. You called out. I told her about the dream, about Sarah, and she listened, her eyes filled with a compassion that felt ancient, like she'd seen more sorrow than a woman her age ever should. "May I ask you something?" I said, my voice low. "Last night, when you were humming, it was my wife's favorite hymn. And the other night, I heard you whisper something to Faith. You said, 'Your mother told me to find you.' What did you mean?" The silence in the room was deafening. She stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. "It's complicated, Mr. Morgan. I've got time," I said, my voice harder than I intended. I needed to know. "Did you know my wife?" She finally turned to look at me, her dark eyes unreadable. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew Sarah." The confession hit me like a physical blow. "How? She never mentioned you." "Aduo, we met in Chicago," Ruth explained. "4 years ago. I was working in a hospital. She was visiting her cousin, Emma." My mind raced. Sarah had spent a summer in Chicago with Emma before we were even married. "You kept in touch all this time?" "Your wife made an impression," Ruth said, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "She was kind to me during a very difficult time in my life." There it was again, that wall, the hint of a darker story she refused to tell. "So it wasn't a coincidence," I said, more to myself than to her. "Sarah, she arranged this?" "She made me promise," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "She wrote to me, told me she was expecting twins, and that she had a bad feeling. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would come. She said she would leave instructions with Pastor Wilson." The pieces were clicking into place, but they formed a picture I didn't understand. A picture of my wife planning for her own death, reaching out to a stranger from her past to protect the children she would never know. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, the unfairness of it all making my voice raw. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a weary wisdom. "Would you have believed me, Mr. Morgan? A stranger at your door, in the middle of a storm, claiming a connection to your dead wife? Or would you have sent me away?" She had a point. I would have thrown her out. And Faith would be dead. "And what would have happened to Faith that night?" she asked softly, as if reading my mind. The unspoken question hung in the air between us. "There's more, isn't there?" I said. "More you're not telling me." "Yes," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the sleeping baby in her arms. "But some stories are better left in the dark." Before I could argue, Grace started to cry from the other room. The moment was broken. As I watched Ruth go to my other daughter, I realized I was no closer to understanding the woman who had taken over my home. She had known my wife. She had saved my daughter. But who was Ruth Holloway? And what terrible secrets had she brought with her to my doorstep? The revelation that Ruth knew Sarah changed the air in the cabin. It was thick with unspoken questions. Every time I looked at her, I saw a ghost of my wife's hidden life. I found myself watching her, searching for clues. The way she always wore long sleeves, even when the cabin was warm. The way she would sometimes stare out the window at the empty prairie. Her expression so full of sorrow, it made my own heart ache. She never received mail. She never spoke of any family but a sister. She was a woman without a past, tethered to my home only by a promise to a dead woman. One afternoon, I came back from the fields earlier than usual. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I pushed the door open and found Ruth on her knees by the hearth, her back to me. She was sobbing, not loud, hysterical crying, but silent, shoulder-shaking sobs of pure despair. I froze, not knowing what to do. Before I could say anything, she seemed to sense me. She stiffened, quickly wiped her eyes, and stood up, her composure snapping back into place like a soldier's mask. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice a little shaky, "you're back early." "Are you all right?" I asked, the question sounding stupid and small. "I'm fine," she said, turning away to busy herself at the stove. "Just a passing sadness." But I had seen her face. It wasn't sadness. It was terror. Later that day, I decided I had to know more. I told Ruth I was riding into town for supplies, a believable lie. But instead of going to town, I circled back and hid my horse in the woods overlooking the farm. I waited. For what, I didn't know. An hour later, I saw it. A rider approaching from the east. A rough-looking man on a tired horse. He didn't come to the house. He stopped at the edge of my property, near the old cottonwood tree. And then Ruth slipped out of the back of the cabin. She moved quickly, furtively, glancing over her shoulder as if she was afraid of being followed. My blood ran cold. I watched from the trees as she met the man. They spoke in low, urgent tones. I was too far away to hear the words, but I saw her press a small, cloth-wrapped package into his hand. He nodded, then handed her something back, a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. He tipped his hat and rode off, disappearing back the way he came. Ruth stood there for a long moment, staring after him, before clutching the pouch to her chest and hurrying back to the cabin. My mind was reeling. Who was that man? What was in the package? Was she selling my things? Was she planning to rob me and run? The trust I had started to build crumbled into dust. When I got back to the cabin, I confronted her. Who was that man, Ruth? She turned from the cradle where she was changing Grace, her face a perfect mask of confusion. What man, Mr. Morgan? Don't lie to me, I snarled, my voice louder than I intended. I saw you at the cottonwood tree. Who was he? The color drained from her face. She looked cornered, like a trapped animal. You followed me. Damn right I followed you. Now answer the question. He's a friend, she stammered. He was delivering a message. A message that you paid for? I shot back. She flinched. It's not what you think, Mr. Morgan, I swear. Then what is it? I demanded. Tell me the truth, or by God, you'll be out of this house by morning. She looked from me to the twins, her eyes filled with desperation. I can't, she whispered. If I tell you, it will put you and the girls in terrible danger. We're already in danger, I yelled. The danger of a liar living under my roof. The argument was cut short by a knock on the door. It was Pastor Wilson. He took one look at our faces and knew something was wrong. Abe, Miss Holloway, he said, his expression grave. May I come in? We need to talk. He stepped inside and shut the door. There's a man in town, he said, his voice low. He's asking questions. About you, Miss Holloway, and about you, Abe. He says his name is Caleb Holloway. Ruth let out a small, strangled gasp and stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The terror I had seen on her face earlier was back, tenfold. Mr. Morgan, the pastor said, turning to me. The letter Sarah left me. It wasn't just a request for help. It was a warning. She warned me that if Ruth ever came here, this man would likely follow. He's Ruth's brother-in-law, and he believes she's a murderer. My world tilted on its axis. Murderer. Brother-in-law. The pieces were swirling, forming a monstrous picture I couldn't comprehend. I looked at Ruth, who was pale and shaking, her eyes wide with a fear so profound it was terrifying to witness. I had thought she was a liar, a thief, but the truth was infinitely worse. The woman I had trusted with my children, the woman who had saved my daughter's life, was a fugitive, and her past, a past she had tried so desperately to outrun, had just found its way to our doorstep. The pastor's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Murderer. The word echoed in the small cabin, bouncing off the rough-hewn walls. I stared at Ruth, really stared at her, trying to see the monster the pastor described. But all I saw was a terrified woman, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. It's not true, she whispered, her voice trembling. None of it. Then what is the truth, Ruth? I asked, my own voice deadly quiet. Because I'm done with the secrets. Pastor Wilson cleared his throat. Perhaps I should give you two some privacy. No, I said, my eyes never leaving Ruth's face. You're part of this. You brought her here. You can stay. Ruth took a deep, shuddering breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into icy water. She sank into a chair at the table, her whole body seeming to collapse. My husband was James Holloway, she began, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Caleb is his older brother. James. He was a respected man, a banker's son, charming, and a monster. She unconsciously touched her wrist, the one with the scar. He was a violent drunk. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward. He swore it would never happen again. He lied. My gut clenched. I had seen men like that in the war. Men who found pleasure in cruelty. The beatings got worse, she continued, her eyes fixed on the wooden table. Especially when I didn't get pregnant. He called me barren, worthless. The truth is, I was taking herbs to prevent it. I couldn't bring a child into that hell. And Caleb knew, I asked. He knew, she confirmed. He saw the bruises. He heard the fights. But the Holloways protect their own. In their world, a wife is property. The man I'd seen her with in the woods, the package, the money, it all came rushing back to me. There was a man, she said, her voice dropping even lower. Henry Walsh, a friend of James from the bank. He was a good man. He saw what was happening. He offered to help me escape. He had a sister in Chicago who would take me in. Her breath hitched. The night we were supposed to leave, James came home early. He was drunk in a rage. He found us packing my small bag. He took the fireplace poker and he attacked Henry. Her voice broke. He killed him, Abe. He just kept hitting him. I tried to stop him and he turned on me. She held up her wrist, pulling back the sleeve to fully reveal the scar. It was stark and white against her skin. This is where the poker broke my arm when I tried to shield my face. I felt sick. When it was over, she whispered, James looked at Henry's body, then at me. He said, well, they'll say you did it. They'll say you were running away with your lover. And he was right. His family owns the town. Who would believe me? So you ran, I said. Henry had already bought me a train ticket. I took it and fled. I never saw James again. Pastor Wilson said Caleb thinks you killed James too. Ruth shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. James killed himself 6 months later. But Caleb couldn't accept that his brother was a murderer and a coward. It was easier to believe I was a black widow who had driven him to it. He's been hunting me ever since. The pieces finally fell into place. The secrecy, the fear, the man in the woods. The man I saw you with, I said. He was Henry's brother, she confirmed. He's the one who found me in Chicago, told me about Sarah's letter to the pastor. He's been helping me stay one step ahead of Caleb. The money he gave me was what's left of the funds Henry set aside to help me start over. And Sarah, my Sarah. How does Sarah fit into all this? I met her at the hospital in Chicago right after I escaped, Ruth explained. I was living under a different name. But Sarah, she saw through it. She saw the pain. I eventually told her everything. She was the first person who ever believed me. Her eyes filled with tears. Her cousin, Emma, was engaged to Henry Walsh. Sarah was there helping plan the wedding when he was killed. She felt responsible in a way. She helped me get settled, gave me money, wrote to me. The promise she made me keep. It was a debt she felt she owed. The complexity of it all was staggering. My wife's life was interwoven with this dark, violent story in a way I could never have imagined. The pastor, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. Caleb Holloway is not just a grieving brother, Abe. He's a Pinkerton detective. He told me the Holloway family hired him to bring Ruth to justice. He has legal authority. The stakes just kept getting higher. He showed me a wanted poster, the pastor added grimly, for a woman named Rachel Holloway, for murder and theft. The face on it was hers. Ruth flinched as if struck. I was now, officially, harboring a wanted fugitive. The law was on Caleb's side. He's staying at the hotel, Pastor Wilson said. He's been asking everyone about a woman matching Ruth's description, and he's been asking about you, Abe, about the widower with the twin babies. He knew she was here, or he suspected it strongly enough to circle his prey. I have to leave, Ruth said, jumping to her feet. Tonight, now, before he finds me here. I can't put you and the girls in the middle of this. No, I said, the word coming out hard as iron. You're not running anymore. She stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. Abe, you don't understand. He's a Pinkerton. He'll have the law on his side. He will ruin you for helping me. Let him try, I said, a cold anger settling deep in my bones. I looked at this woman, who had endured so much, who had come here to honor a promise to my wife, who had saved my child. and I made a choice. This is my home, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. My land, and you are under my protection. We face him. Together. For a long moment, she just stared at me, tears streaming silently down her face. Then she gave a small, shaky nod. Just then, we heard a shout from outside. It was faint, carried on the wind. I ran to the window and peered out into the twilight. On the ridge overlooking the farm, a fire had been lit, a single bright flame against the darkening sky. Ruth was beside me in an instant. "It's the signal," she breathed, her voice filled with panic. "It's from Henry's brother. It means Caleb isn't just in town. He's on his way. He's coming here. Now." Panic seized the room. "Get the girls," I ordered Ruth, my mind shifting into the cold, calculated state it had learned on the battlefield. "Keep them in the back room, away from the windows. Bar the door." "Abe, what are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm going to defend my home," I said, grabbing my rifle from its rack above the fireplace. I checked the action. It was loaded. Pastor Wilson put a hand on my arm. "Son, think about this. This man is a detective. He'll likely have men with him. You can't fight the law." "He's not the law," I shot back. "He's a hired bully on a personal vendetta, and he's not setting foot on my property." I moved through the small cabin, checking the locks on the windows, shoving the heavy wooden table against the front door. Every instinct screamed at me to prepare for a fight. Ruth reappeared from the back room, her face pale. "They're asleep," she whispered. "Thank God." The sound of approaching horses became audible, a rhythmic drumming that grew steadily louder. Not one horse, several. My blood ran cold. The pastor was right. He'd brought a posse. "Ruth, get back in that room and don't come out, no matter what you hear," I said, moving to the front window and peering through a crack in the shutters. "Pastor, you should go. This isn't your fight." "I'm a man of God, Abraham," he said, his voice firm. "But I'm also your friend. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." Through the crack, I could see them. 5 riders, dark shapes against the moonlit prairie. They stopped just outside the range of my rifle, a silent, menacing line. One man dismounted and walked forward, his hands empty but his hip holding a holstered pistol. Caleb Holloway. "Abraham Morgan," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I know you're in there, and I know you have Rachel Holloway with you. I'm a registered agent with the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I have a warrant for her arrest. Send her out, and this will all be over peacefully." "Go to hell, Holloway," I yelled back. "The woman you're looking for isn't here. Don't play games with me, Morgan. We know she is. My sources in town are very reliable." "Harriet Blackwood," I thought with a curse. She must have told him. "You have 1 hour to send her out," Caleb shouted. "If you don't, we are authorized to use force to enter the premises and apprehend the fugitive. The choice is yours, Morgan. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He walked back to his men and they settled in to wait. A siege. He had laid siege to my home. "What are we going to do?" the pastor asked, his face grim. "We wait," I said. "He's trying to intimidate us. He won't risk a firefight if he doesn't have to." The hour stretched into an eternity. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the pastor's quiet prayers. I could feel Ruth's presence in the back room, a silent, terrified waiting. Suddenly, I heard a small noise from the back room. The door creaked open and Ruth slipped out. "I can't let you do this," she whispered, her face etched with agony. "I have to give myself up." "Like hell you will," I said, grabbing her arm. "We're in this together, remember?" "But the girls need you," I said fiercely. "And so do I." The words slipped out before I could stop them, raw and true. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine in the dim light. "Abe," she said, her voice barely audible, "there's something else you need to know about Sarah. Why she made me promise." She took a breath. "Sarah didn't just know my story. She was part of it. When she was in Chicago, staying with her cousin Emma, she was there the night Henry was murdered. She saw it. She saw what James did." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "She saw the murder?" "She was waiting outside in a carriage to help us leave," Ruth explained, tears welling in her eyes. When she heard the screams, she ran to the house. She saw James standing over Henry's body, the poker in his hand, and she saw him strike me. She was terrified. James threatened her, told her if she said a word, he'd ruin her, hurt her family. She was just a young woman, far from home. She was scared, so she helped me get to the train station, gave me all the money she had, and she ran. My Sarah. My gentle, kind Sarah had carried this terrible secret for years, the guilt she must have felt. The promise wasn't just friendship, Ruth whispered. It was atonement. She felt she had abandoned me. She swore if I ever needed anything, she would be there. This was her way of keeping that promise from beyond the grave. It reframed everything. The intensity of Sarah's request, her premonition of death. She wasn't just worried about leaving her children motherless. She was terrified of leaving her debt to Ruth unpaid. A bright orange glow suddenly lit up the night outside. "Fire!" the pastor yelled, pointing to the window. I looked out. One of Caleb's men had crept up in the darkness and thrown a torch onto the roof of my barn. Flames were already licking up the dry timber. "He's trying to smoke us out," I snarled, fury boiling in my veins. My livestock, my hay, my entire livelihood was in that barn. He's going to burn it all down. I had to do something. I couldn't let him destroy everything I had built. "Ruth, pastor, stay here," I said, grabbing a bucket of water. "I have to try and save the barn." "It's a trap, Abe," Ruth cried. "He just wants to draw you out." "I have no choice," I yelled, unbarring the back door. As I burst out into the night, the heat from the fire hit me like a wave. The whole side of the barn was engulfed in flames. And just as Ruth had predicted, it was a trap. Two of Caleb's men were waiting in the shadows. They rushed me, tackling me to the ground. The bucket flew from my hand as I hit the dirt hard. I fought back, the rage giving me strength, but there were two of them. One held my arms while the other pressed the cold barrel of a pistol to my temple. "The farmer's more trouble than he's worth," one of them grunted. "Holloway said to take him out if we had to." From the front of the house, I heard Caleb's voice boom. "You have 5 minutes, Morgan, or your whole farm goes up in smoke. Send out the woman." I was trapped, powerless, lying in the dirt with a gun to my head, watching my life's work turn to ash. And inside the cabin, the woman I had sworn to protect was about to be forced to choose between her life and mine. The heat from the burning barn was intense, the roar of the flames filling the night. Lying there in the dirt, with the cold steel of a pistol against my skull, I felt a familiar, sickening sense of helplessness. It was the same feeling I'd had on the battlefield, watching friends fall, unable to do a damn thing. "Time's up, Morgan!" Caleb's voice echoed from the front of the house. "I'm done waiting." The man holding the gun to my head cocked the hammer. The sound was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. This is it, I thought. This is how it ends. But then, another sound cut through the night. The thunder of hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming fast. "Who the hell is that?" my captor muttered, glancing over his shoulder. From the direction of town, a dozen riders crested the hill. They weren't a posse. They were my neighbors. Thomas Jenkins from the livery was in the lead, holding a lantern high. Beside him were farmers, blacksmiths, men I knew from town, all armed with hunting rifles and shotguns. "Caleb Holloway!" Thomas Jenkins' voice boomed across the prairie. "You are on Abraham Morgan's land. He is our neighbor. You and your hired guns have 5 minutes to get off his property before this becomes a town matter." Caleb, caught completely by surprise, stared at the line of armed farmers. His posse of 5 was suddenly facing a dozen determined men who knew the land and were defending one of their own. The two men holding me down exchanged a nervous look. Their bravado was gone, replaced by the uncertainty of men who realized they were outnumbered and out of their element. Just then, a wagon came rattling up the road behind the riders. It wasn't another farmer. It was Harriet Blackwood, holding the reins herself, whipping the horses on. Beside her sat a woman, a frail, older woman wrapped in a shawl. The wagon pulled to a stop, and Pastor Wilson, who had slipped out of the cabin in the chaos, helped the woman down. She walked slowly, unsteadily, towards the standoff. She walked right past the farmers, right towards Caleb Holloway. "Mother?" Caleb whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. What are you doing here? The woman, Eleanor Holloway, stopped in front of her son. Her face, illuminated by the firelight, was a mask of grief and resolve. I am here to stop this madness, Caleb, she said, her voice thin but strong. I am here to tell the truth. Harriet Blackwood stepped forward. I sent a wire to Mrs. Holloway 3 days ago, she announced, her voice ringing with authority. I've been corresponding with her for weeks, ever since you first arrived in town spreading your lies. I knew her years ago, and I knew she was a woman of conscience. Eleanor Holloway turned to face the assembled men. The woman you are hunting, Ruth Holloway, she said, her voice gaining strength, is innocent. My son James killed Henry Walsh. He confessed it all in a letter he wrote before he took his own life. That letter was a lie, Caleb spat, his face contorted with rage and confusion. She manipulated him. No, son, his mother said, her eyes filling with tears. The only one lying is you. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small, worn leather-bound journal. This was James's private journal. I found it after you left. In it, he details not only his abuse of his wife, but the corrupt business dealings you and he were involved in. The fraudulent loans, the stolen investments. He wrote that he was afraid you were going to kill him to cover it all up. The final shocking truth fell into place. You weren't hunting Ruth because of James's death, I said, finally understanding. I'd managed to get to my feet as my captors, distracted by the scene, had loosened their grip. You were hunting her because you thought she had the confession letter, the evidence that could destroy you and the family name. Caleb stared at his mother, his face ashen. The whole facade, the righteous anger, the family honor, it all crumbled away, revealing the desperate, cornered criminal underneath. His posse, realizing they'd been used as muscle for a common crook, began to back away, lowering their weapons. It's over, Caleb, his mother said, her voice breaking. There's no more running. At that moment, the front door of the cabin opened. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, her face streaked with tears but her head held high. She looked at Caleb, not with fear but with a quiet, steely resolve. You tried to destroy my life, she said, her voice clear and steady. You hunted me like an animal, but you failed. Goodness prevails, Caleb. Truth prevails. Caleb looked from Ruth to his mother, to the dozen rifles pointed in his direction. He was trapped, utterly and completely defeated. He didn't say a word. He just turned, walked to his horse and rode away into the darkness, a ruined man disappearing into the night. The silence that followed was broken by the crackle of the fire. The barn! Thomas yelled, and suddenly everyone was in motion. A bucket brigade formed, neighbors working side by side with a frantic energy, fighting the flames that threatened to consume my livelihood. I stood there for a moment, watching them, watching this community that had come together to save me. Then I felt a hand on my arm. It was Ruth. We looked at each other, the smoke and chaos swirling around us. And in her eyes I saw the end of a long, terrible journey and the beginning of a new one. It's over, she whispered. It's finally over. Yes, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It is. We had survived the siege. We had survived the fire. We had survived the past. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the prairie, casting a golden glow on the faces of our friends and neighbors, I knew, deep in my soul, that we were finally home. 1 year later, I stood under that same big oak tree by the creek, the one where I'd proposed to Sarah. But this time I wasn't alone with a ghost. I was waiting for my bride. Pastor Wilson stood beside me, sweating in his Sunday best. Thomas Jenkins and his wife were trying to keep Faith and Grace, now sturdy toddlers, from falling into the creek. And Harriet Blackwood, looking less like a town matriarch and more like a proud godmother, was watching the path from the farm. Then I saw her, Ruth, walking towards me in a simple blue dress, her dark hair woven with wildflowers. And she was smiling, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face, a smile I had come to love more than I ever thought possible. As she took her place beside me, our little girls, who had been wrangled onto a blanket, started shouting, "Mama, Dada!" A ripple of laughter went through our small gathering of friends. Ruth squeezed my hand. The pastor cleared his throat. Dearly beloved, he began, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Abraham Morgan and Ruth Holloway. As he spoke the familiar words, I looked at Ruth. I saw the woman who had appeared like an angel in a storm, the woman who had saved my daughter's life, and then slowly, patiently, had saved my own. I saw the quiet courage that had seen her through an unspeakable hell, and the boundless love she poured into our two little girls. I do, I said, my voice firm and clear when the pastor asked. I do, she replied, her voice unwavering, her eyes shining with tears of joy. We exchanged simple gold bands. As I slipped the ring onto her finger, I saw that it covered the last faint trace of the scar on her wrist. A new circle, a symbol of a new life, laid over the mark of an old one. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the pastor declared with a grin. You may kiss your bride, Abe. And I did. I kissed her, and in that kiss was all the sorrow of the past and all the hope for the future. It was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. As we turned to face our friends, my gaze drifted past them, up the rise to the small family plot behind the farm. Sarah's grave was there, marked with a simple, beautiful headstone. Ruth had planted prairie violets all around it, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that Sarah would approve. She had sent this woman to us. Her final act of love was to give us a new one. Later, as our friends ate cake and the twins chased butterflies in the tall grass, Ruth began to sing, an old hymn, her voice rising clear and true in the summer air. I closed my eyes, a prayer of gratitude in my heart, for the woman I had lost, for the woman I had found, for the children who bound us all together, for the mysterious, terrible, and beautiful way that life, even after the most devastating storms, finds a way to grow again. The past would always be a part of us, but it no longer defined us. Together we were building something new. A family forged not just by love, but by courage. A love tested by fire and made stronger for the burning. They say love comes from the places we least expect. For me and Ruth, it came on the wind of a storm and proved that sometimes the family you choose is the one that truly saves you. If you enjoyed this story of survival and unexpected love, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the incredible story of twists and turns we have coming for you next week.